Hello, church. I'm making this video series special for us. It will be available on YouTube, and so other people will be able to watch it, but I'm making this specifically for our church, the Way Church. And that's because at our retreat this year, we are going to be having Dr. Joel Comiskey as our guest speaker, which I am really, really, really excited about. And I hope you are too. And certainly if you knew of Joel Comiskey like I do and like my parents do, you would be very, very excited about having him. So getting ready for our retreat this year, I thought it would be appropriate to read a book by Joel Comiskey. And here's this picture. This book is titled Planting Churches That Reproduce. Now, this isn't part of our normal Sunday studies. We're walking through the book of Acts on Sundays. But I felt like this would just be supplemental. It's about 150 pages, so it's not a very long book. The chapters are kind of short, and he just talks about how to plant churches that reproduce in this book. And of course, in this case, we already have a church. We have a house church. But our goal is multiplication. And so he really gives some outline of that here in this book. And that's why I thought it would be good for us to go ahead and have some understanding of where Joel is coming from before he comes to speak to us and teach us, and a little bit of idea of some of the things he's written. With that in mind, I need to tell you that Joel really comes out of the cell church methodology and background. And everyone might have an idea in their head of what they think a cell church is. But let me tell you, a cell church basically is a church made up of house churches. Back in the 80s and 90s, they came up with the word cells because cells are small units in the body that make up bigger units. So like in your body, you have cells, and each cell is completely, fully functioning as its own unit, its own being. And cells are the backbone, they're the makeup of the entire being. If you didn't have cells, you wouldn't exist. And so instead of calling them house churches, they were called cells. However, I've shared with you that in the year 2009, I was at a meeting with Joel Comiskey was there, as was Ralph Neighbor. And Ralph Neighbor is kind of the father of the cell church movement, at least in the United States and kind of the Western world. And he said, I heard him say this, he said, I made a mistake by using the term cells. He says, I should have just called them churches. But in a true cell church structure, each cell is considered to be a church. And it is the church. It is the foundation of the church. Now, I understand in our world, in today's culture, it's common to have big churches that start a small group ministry, and they might call it a cell or célula. But they don't necessarily understand the cell to actually be the church or a church. They understand it to be a ministry of the church. But in a true cell church, each cell is its own individually functioning and sustaining house church. So as we read this book, he'll talk about cells. He'll also talk about simple churches, because those were words that were really common back in this book's from 2009. That was the common words for it. But what he's really talking about with a cell is a house church. And so the idea is that house churches will multiply, and each one will be its own independent, fully functioning, fully sustaining church, but will also remain connected to each other in the same way that cells are connected to a body. And in the traditional cell model, what happens is once there are a certain number of cells, they might come together periodically to worship together in what they call a celebration. But he will point out in here that we have a tendency to think of the worship service as being church, when in reality it's the life of the cell, of the house church that is the church. Okay? So I just wanted to share that with you before we get started. And I guess in this video I'm just going to read the introduction, which is just a couple of pages, but with those 5 minutes from me. And then I'll do chapter 1 in another video. But this is Planting Churches That Reproduce by Dr. Joel Comiskey. And he says in his introduction, Jim Montgomery, the founder of a church planting movement called Dawn, told about a meeting with Donald McGavran, the founder of the church growth movement. Montgomery writes, during the last months of Mary McGavran's illness, my wife Lynn would frequently spend time with her. Donald McGavran would be there too, disregarding his own painful cancer while taking care of his beloved Mary. Lynn said to Donald McGavran, you can be sure Jim and I will continue our commitment to church growth after you're gone. McGavran snapped back. Don't call it church growth anymore. Call it church multiplication. The only way we will get the job of the Great Commission done is to plant a church in every community in the world. Somewhere along the way, the church growth movement became associated with growing one church as large as possible. Donald McGavran perceived that problem and gave church growth a richer meaning, church multiplication. Church multiplication is biblical. Jesus Christ himself revealed a multiplication strategy when he raised up men and women who were willing to scatter and spread the seeds of faith all over the Roman Empire. They were willing to die for their beliefs in the face of incredible odds. These Christ followers planted churches to make new disciples and spread the faith. To plant a church in every nation of the world requires a simple, reproducible strategy. It's not about growing a few churches larger and larger. Ori Brafman and Rod Beckstrom, in their book, The Starfish and the Spider, point out that growing companies have a simple strategy that possesses the DNA of reproduction. If you cut off a starfish's leg, it grows a new one, and that leg can grow into an entirely new starfish. Decentralized, simple church planting operates like the starfish. It can grow and multiply any place in the world. It is not dependent on councils, committees, buildings, or money. Simple church planting offers the exciting possibility of new churches springing up everywhere. And indeed, this is exactly what's happening all over the world. In North America, there's been a flood of books promoting a simple understanding of the Church of Jesus Christ. Neil Cole's book, Organic Church, George Barna's Revolution, and Tom Rainer's Simple Church all point to a yearning in the church today for simple structures that multiply. The question that various authors are trying to answer is, how can we have a church planting movement in the 21st century? Church planting has been my life for the last 25 years. I started a church in downtown Long Beach, California, from my home in 1983. I listened to David Cho speak at Fuller Seminary in 1984. I was so impressed that I bought both his entire tape series and his new book and began to teach my leaders about the home group system. The church did grow and continues its ministry in downtown Long Beach to this day. As I look back, however, I now realize that God was primarily teaching me about simpler, more reproducible church planting strategies. In 1994, 4 years into my first term as a missionary in Ecuador, we planted a church in Quito, along with a national lead pastor and another missionary couple. We took 150 people from the mother church, along with 10 home groups. The church grew quickly, and within 6 years had 280 cells and 1,300 worshipers. My main role was guiding the small group infrastructure. In 2003, as a family, we started a church in my home in Moreno Valley, California, called Wellspring. We multiplied the first home group many times and eventually gathered those groups together for celebration. I was the lead pastor for the first 4.5 years. In June 2008, I became the church planting pastor of Wellspring, having turned the lead pastor role over to Eric Glover. Our goal from the beginning was to keep the church simple and reproducible, and for it to eventually become a church planting movement. Church planting is not easy. Someone has said that it's like drinking from a fire hose, fast and furious. Throughout this book, I hope to share the pain, struggles, and breakthroughs of my own church planting journey. More importantly, we'll look at biblical and practical principles that will help you, the church planter, lay a strong foundation to start simple, reproducible churches. That is the introduction to this book, Planting Churches That Reproduce. Obviously, this is aimed at church planters, but since we're all in this together, I think we can all learn from the principles that we will see here in this book. So that was the introduction. Next time I'm going to read chapter 1, and I hope you will listen to these. All right. Well, God bless you. I will see you soon.